Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games. Today we continue our series in Epic Armageddon, and we're going to have a look at terrain and how it interacts with the whole game. If you are interested in Epic Armageddon, then I suggest you check out the other videos that I've released so far, going over the rules and how to play. So let's get into today's video and have a look at the terrain. Terrain. It just means the things on the board that you use to simulate a battlefield, like buildings, hills, etc. The point of terrain is to add some tactical variance to the game so that you aren't just battling your opponent over an open ground all the time. It makes it more interesting to look at and to play on. There are more rules available on setting up terrain, either in a scenario that you might be playing if there's special rules there, but in the tournament pack, which a lot of people use to play Epic, and we'll have a look at that in a future video. So what are the effects of terrain on units? Generally comes down to three different effects that terrain will have with regard to units moving around the battlefield. Firstly, some terrain has no effect on a unit moving, and the unit continues as normal. Secondly, some terrain is impassable and will block the movement of a unit completely. And lastly, some terrain is dangerous to units moving through it and may cause the unit to take a dangerous terrain test to see if any damage is suffered as a result of moving through it. Sometimes terrain will have these effects on certain types of units, but not on others. So let's have a look at dangerous terrain tests, as these are probably the most exciting of those three. So the first question to ask is, when do you have to take a dangerous terrain test? And the answer is either when a unit moves into dangerous terrain as part of their move, or when a unit starts in dangerous terrain and moves either out of or through that terrain. In our example here, we have 3 tanks moving twice. The first move would cause a dangerous terrain test for the bottom 2 tanks as they enter the dangerous terrain, and the second move would also do the same as they start their move in the dangerous terrain and then move out of it. The top tank never enters the terrain, so never has to take a test. So how do we take these dangerous terrain tests? It's pretty simple. Roll a d6 for each unit that is affected by the terrain. On a roll of a 2 or higher, the unit is fine and suffers no ill effect, but every unit that rolls a 1 is destroyed and there are no saves allowed. It is important to note that the formation as a whole does not suffer blast markers for any casualties it receives from dangerous terrain tests. Now, obviously, no one wants to lose units to dangerous terrain as you travel through it, so if you choose to play it safe, you can move cautiously when encountering dangerous terrain. This means that a unit can reduce its move down to 5 centimeters, so a pretty small movement value, but they will receive a re-roll on their dangerous terrain test results, thereby giving them a better chance on passing as they go through the dangerous terrain. Okay, let's have a look at some frequently asked questions that arise from this so far. Firstly, how many d6 does a war engine roll when it enters dangerous terrain? A war engine is a particular type of unit, usually much bigger than regular units, and follows a lot of the vehicle rules. We will have a look at them in an upcoming vehicle. The answer to this, just for future knowledge, is 1. So just remember that any unit will only ever have to roll 1 dice for a dangerous terrain test. Our second question, are units that are making a countercharge moves subject to dangerous terrain tests? Now, countercharges are made during the assault phase. Again, we don't have to be concerned about that here, but just more so the answer is yes. If they are making a countercharge move, which is a type of move, it is susceptible to the dangerous terrain test. So there's an important principle that the game designers want you to know in their design of the rules, and that is, in their opinion, that arguments and rulings over terrain very easily break out. No matter our best intentions as players, we get into these arguments over the effect of terrain in the game, and usually it's in our favor or because of our understanding of it. Their recommendation is to apply the -1 to hit modifier for units in cover very generously when playing Epic Armageddon. So if in doubt, just apply this modifier. I think they are trying to say don't spend most of your game time stuck in arguments, but rather be generous with your opponent. So we should have a look at cover to hit modifiers now, so that this makes a bit more sense for us as we look at this rule they're talking of. One of the main interactions terrain has in the game is to make it harder to shoot at the opponent's units or them shoot at your units. And as a result, units can receive a to hit modifier, meaning that when they are shot at, the units firing will reduce their attack rolls by 1. This makes them miss a lot more. We're going to look at this more during our next video, which will be on shooting. But what we want to look at here now is when this applies with cover. So this modifier applies when a unit is in terrain and is at least partially obscured from view. So I've got the example on screen at the moment of the orc boys who are in this ruined building and partially obscured, so the modifier, the -1 to hit them, would apply to the Leman Russ trying to shoot them. Secondly, it also applies when a unit fires at another unit and there is terrain that intervenes its line of fire and partially obscures the view to the unit being fired upon. So once again, we've got the same example with the boys and the Leman Russ, and the boys, they're not right in or near the terrain, but the line of fire from the Leman Russ passes over the ruined building or the wall or whatever it might be there, and therefore they are partially obscured, and so the -1 to hit modifier would also apply in this case. Let's go back to our frequently asked questions. So we have a bit of a bizarre question here and now, and it is, when does a unit count as being in cover? It's a weird question because surely the rules would tell you when this would happen, right? Well, they leave it a bit open, and the answer here, as we will see, is that this should be brought up in the 5-minute warm-up. That's the discussion that you have with your opponent before the game. It's not the most helpful answer, but this represents that the terrain is very wide and varied in how people build it or how people buy it, and then how it gets used on the battlefield. I've never found too many issues around terrain, but there are little nuances and intricacies, so it's a good practice before the game to look over all the terrain on the board with your opponent and just work out what will apply and where. Helpful questions might be, does this count as in cover here with this building or these ruins or this forest or whatever it might be? And just remember to apply that hit modifier, that 2-hit modifier, quite generously as recommended. This question is important because of the rules that we're about to look at now and go through. And that is the topic of infantry cover saves. So let's have a look at it. It's important to know when something counts as being in cover or protected by cover, because infantry can receive what is called a cover save from different types of terrain. And there is a terrain table to help you out in determining when this applies and to what extent, thankfully. The point of this cover save is to allow the unit to take this cover save instead of their armor save when they have been fired upon, if it is better than their armor save. If it's not better, then you really wouldn't bother with it. But you don't get to use both. You use one or the other. Just so we know, this cover save for your infantry is in addition to the negative or the -1 to hit modifier that we've already talked about by being in cover. The difference being that infantry get this bonus cover save from terrain too, unlike vehicles. So just a reminder, always check your opponent's understanding of what being in cover means before the game, so that you'll have a better understanding of when your infantry are in cover and might benefit from a cover save. Okay, so now let's look at some specific types of terrain and some of the benefits or effects that they have on the battlefield. So we're going to start with fortifications first. And we've got some generic photos here just to give you an idea of what it might mean or what it might look like. But generally, fortifications are things that are meant to have troops or perhaps vehicles dug into them or held up in them. They're usually defenses. In Epic Armageddon, fortifications provide a -1 to hit modifier to the units inside, as you might expect. This is the standard -1 to hit for being in cover, so it's not an additional one. They also allow the units within to ignore the crossfire special rule when they're being shot at. But there'll be more on that when we get to the video that covers crossfire rule in a couple of videos' time. Probably the bonus that most people enjoy about fortifications is the 3+ cover save that they afford to infantry. This makes infantry very hard to dig out of fortifications if they're in there, at least by shooting, that is. So assault can be a bit different. On top of that, vehicles usually treat fortifications as impassable unless there's a special rule that says that they're specifically designed to hold vehicles. But that'll be a case-by-case basis, depending perhaps on the scenario or the fortifications being used. But in general, they are impassable to vehicles. Moving on, we come next to hills. And hills are great for breaking up line of fire in a different way to other terrain. They will provide the benefit, usually to units on top of the hill, of a greater view of the battlefield and potentially a greater line of fire to other formations. They are treated as being open ground for all intents and purposes, so there's nothing too special here, but it's worth a mention. On the topic of open ground, we now come to open ground. Believe it or not, open ground does provide a benefit in some circumstances. It's not much of a benefit, but it can provide a benefit. If an infantry unit is on overwatch, so it has to be infantry, has to be on overwatch, then that unit will count as being in cover, meaning they benefit from the -1 to hit modifier, and they are also afforded a 5+ cover save. However, these benefits only last while the formation is in Overwatch or on Overwatch. Once their Overwatch has ended, maybe they've fired and lost it, or maybe they've taken a different activation, they lose the benefits that the terrain provides them. So more on Overwatch in a couple of videos, but just worth emphasizing that this applies for infantry units, not for vehicles, and they may both be in the same formation, but the infantry will benefit from cover when on Overwatch in open ground. Now we come to roads and the effects they can have on units. First of all, roads add an additional 5 centimeters to a unit's move value for any move that they take that stays entirely within the confines of the road. So there is a speed benefit, however minimal that might be, but you have to stay on the road. There is also a special rule here that a lot of people may not know or remember, but it is one. It's called a road march, in which a unit automatically will pass a test to do a march move, but they must stay entirely on the road for their entire activation. Obviously, they still get that +5 centimeter bonus to each move they make on the march, but the entire march move, so 3 moves potentially, can be taken, but all must stay on the road. But you will automatically pass that action test. Situationally, this can be good, or it can be good for certain armies that might have harder time activating. But every now and then, this will help, particularly when it comes to maybe grabbing an objective. But just a note to make on this as well, that this can only be done if all units in the formation begin their activation on the road. So you'll have to set this up the turn before or during deployment, or perhaps if you play with a 6-lane highway on the board, then it won't really matter. And lastly, before we delve into our terrain table a bit deeper, we're just going to have a look at armored vehicles being used as cover. So infantry units will receive a -1 to hit modifier, so receive that cover bonus when they are in base contact with an armored vehicle or a war engine. So this represents the infantry taking cover from using the vehicle as cover and being harder to pick off by the enemy, but they must be in base contact with a vehicle or a war engine. However, this special interaction between infantry and armored vehicles only applies to the hit modifier, and it does not grant a cover save at all to the infantry. You will probably find this interaction quite helpful for your infantry when it comes to those that are being transported by vehicles. And when they get out of their vehicle, they can still stay in base contact and receive that cover bonus. Okay, now let's move on to the terrain reference table. This table will allow you to look up quickly and hopefully helpfully during a game to see what benefits a certain piece of terrain might afford to infantry, to vehicles, or to war engines. In particular, it will tell you, is it impassable? Is it dangerous terrain? Will it give a cover save to infantry? And it will even tell you if there are further rules or special rules that you need to be aware of with that particular type of terrain. So in this first line of the table that we're looking at here, we're looking at buildings. Buildings, as we see, provide a pretty strong cover save for infantry of 4+, so that's a very good cover save, but they are treated as impassable to both vehicles and war engines. This means that they cannot enter through them at all, while infantry can move freely through them and will get the benefit of cover save. So this is really designed to be helpful for your infantry. Remember, this doesn't mean that buildings won't provide cover for vehicles. That means the -1 to hit modifier that we've seen, but it will be in terms of the building being intervening terrain and whether the building obscures the vehicle from the opposing unit that's trying to fire on them. Next we have cliffs, and cliffs are nice and easy. If you have them in your game, they are impassable to everybody. So there's no climbing up the hill or driving up a cliff face. Fortifications, we've already gone over these a little bit, but they provide a 3+ cover save to infantry. They are impassable to war engines, but there are potentially special rules for vehicles and infantry as well, and these mainly refer to what I said before about how some fortifications can be designed to hold vehicles, but this is not the norm. Next up, we have jungle terrain. And jungle is a nice, dense terrain affording lots of hiding spaces and imagine, camouflage opportunities for infantry. As a result, it is another good, strong cover save of 4+ for your infantry units. Vehicles will treat jungle as too dense to enter, and as such, it'll be impassable. However, war engines, which, they're usually bigger units, are able to try and plow through the jungle and carve a path through it. However, there is still some risk there, so it counts as dangerous terrain towards war engines. Moving on, we have marsh, and a marsh is not really a pleasant piece of terrain. In my experience, it counts as dangerous terrain to all types of units. Infantry, they fare a little bit better, I suppose, than the others, but they only get a 6+ cover save if they're benefiting from being in a marsh. So not great, nothing to count on, I would think. Next we have open ground and hill slopes. These types of terrain, while changing the perspective of a unit on the battlefield, perhaps provide no other concrete benefits or hindrances to any units. So nice and easy. Rivers are a great way, I think, to break up the battlefield, although you may want to invest in some river crossings or bridges too if you play with them. They give a 6+ cover save to infantry, so minimal cover there. But they also count as dangerous terrain to that infantry as well. Vehicles have a bit of a rougher time by rivers, being blocked out by them completely, and they treat them as impassable. While war engines, oddly enough, fare quite well and they suffer no ill effect from rivers. Roads have no real impact on any units in terms of providing cover or impeding movement. However, just remember that all units, doesn't matter their type of the unit, will benefit from that bonus move that we saw as a special rule. Next up is ruins and rubble, and they are somewhat similar to buildings, generally destroyed buildings. So they provide a 4+ cover save to the infantry that are sheltered within. However, unlike buildings, ruins and rubble allow vehicles and war engines to enter them as terrain, but there is still a risk there, so it is dangerous terrain for those units. Scrub, which if you don't know what scrub is, it's like undergrowth, a lot of small bushes and ground cover, things like that, and it's represented by only providing a 6+ cover save to infantry, but it has no other effect on any units in terms of movement. Last but definitely not least, we have woods. Now, woods are similar to jungles, but generally seen as not as dense as jungles. So the cover save for infantry is downgraded to a 5+ in this case. Vehicles and war engines, both of them, however, are allowed to enter the woods. However, they both treat it as dangerous terrain if they choose to do so. Well, we got through the table, but I do generally have a copy of this near the game when we're playing, just for reference, particularly if you are using a diversity of terrain and you have to try and remember, roads, rubble, rivers, buildings, scrubs, all in one game. You might want to have this sitting next to the board. Okay, so now we come back to everyone's favorite part of these videos. It's FAQ time once again, so let's have a look at some questions that arise from the terrain rules. First up, how many units can claim cover from a fortification? And our answer, if this isn't covered by special rules or the scenario, then it should be brought up in the 5-minute warm-up. This question, I think, really highlights that terrain is so diverse and so different from game table to game table, that it's hard to just have an answer for it. I would strongly suggest that you bring this up before the game with your opponent, just to check each other's understanding of what the fortification does, particularly given that fortifications, they can provide that 3+ cover save to infantry, so they can be very strong pieces of terrain. We still do this in our Epic games, even though, the people that I play with, we've played a number of games. It's as much a refresher on terrain as anything else. All right, let's continue. So, can a speed 0 centimeter unit on a road claim the +5 centimeter move bonus? That's an interesting question, as I think most of us would think, well, that's pretty obvious. However, mid-game, you'd rather not come across a situation or a question like this with two wildly differing opinions. So the answer to this is there is no clear distinction in the rules between speed 0 centimeter and immobile units. We recommend you go over it with your opponent during the 5-minute warm-up. A speed 0 centimeter unit could possibly benefit from the road movement bonus, allowing it to move 5 centimeters per move. However, it may obviously not leave the road, as it would then lose its bonus movement. A unit with the speed of a mobile may not move, even on a road. So this shows a bit of an oversight when the Epic Armageddon rules, I think, were initially designed. There are speed 0 centimeter units and there are immobile units. So the question is, what's the difference in them? And unfortunately, we don't really have a concrete answer on, unfortunately. I would say play it either way for 0 centimeter units. I don't think it's a biggie in terms of the effect it'll have on a game, but if you are having 0 centimeter or mobile units in your list, it might be a good thing to work out pre-game with your opponent. Okay, so continuing on, yet again with more FAQs. Can units making a countercharge move on a road claim the +5 centimeter move bonus? So countercharge moves, as I've alluded to, are part of assaults, and we will cover them eventually. So what's the ruling on this? Can you get that bonus move when you do a countercharge? And the answer is no. The moves referenced here are those in actions. A countercharge move is not one of these moves. So a distinction here is drawn up in this FAQ, and the distinction is between countercharging as a type of moving as opposed to moving that comes as part of an action you will take. So just keep the bonus to the moves that are as a result of taking a particular action and not of other forms of movement, I would say, in general. It might just break the game a bit too much if you can get that bonus move during a countercharge, but that will all make sense in time. Can an infantry unit claim cover from enemy armored vehicles? Now, this is an interesting question, as you might be asking, how would this work? I mean, you can't generally be inside an enemy's zone of control or vice versa. However, the one occasion that it's fine to do so is during an assault. And you will see when we cover assaults eventually, it is possible to claim a cover save during assault. To claim cover during assault, not a cover save, when defending and not attacking. And it's done against units providing supporting fire into that assault. Won't get bogged down in that now because there's quite a bit to assaults. but it can happen. So in those cases, can you get a cover from an enemy vehicle, namely the -1 to hit modifier I'm talking about? Yes. Yes, you can. They have ruled that it is possible that enemy armor can provide cover. My advice, refer back to this if it ever comes up, because it may not come up that much. Okay, so last question for our FAQs and then we'll be done. How many infantry can be counted as being in cover when touching an armored vehicle or a war engine? This question addresses whether you can kind of game the system when it comes to the rule of cover for infantry with vehicles. You know, if you have one tank and 10 infantry bases with that tank, can they all get the cover if you can technically make them all touch? The answer is there is no limit as per the written rules, so as long as the infantry bases can touch the armored vehicle or war engine. So it seems that they're saying, yes, you can game it. However, a limit of 2 per armored vehicle or 2 per starting damage capacity of a war engine is an extremely common house rule, enough so that it should be brought up in the 5-minute warm-up. In other words, go ahead and game it and stack as many as you possibly can, though if people want to, then house rule it to 2 per armored vehicle or 2 per damage capacity of a war engine. More on that in a later video too. As always, talk about it before the game. We might actually have to create a list at some point of questions to run through before a game, because I feel we're approaching a pretty good number by now of just little intricacies that might actually come up. Well, once again, we made it to the end of another video in our Epic Armageddon series. Thanks for watching today, and hopefully you're inspired to get some terrain ready for your next game of Epic Armageddon, or perhaps even your first game of Epic Armageddon. Good terrain, I think, adds so much to the game, and different interactions keep things more interesting as you play out your battles. The next video in the series is going to look at shooting and how to destroy your enemies with overwhelming firepower. I won't lie, it will be a big one, so it might take me a few days to get it together, but it's what we've all been waiting for, I think. Feel free to like or subscribe if you want to see the rest of this series, and I'll try and respond to any comments that you might leave as well. See you next time on Too Many Games.